Well, hello there, sweet one. Come on in. Come sit down at the kitchen table. That's right. Pull up that old wooden chair. The one with the little heart carved into the back. My great-grandmother did that with her sewing scissors when she was just 7 years old. I've got some chamomile tea brewing, and the evening light is just perfect, streaming through these lace curtains. Can you smell that? That's lavender from the garden, mixing with the last bit of apple pie I pulled from the oven this afternoon. Now settle in close because I want to tell you about this summer, when one little tomato plant changed everything. Not just for me, mind you, but for our whole town of Willowbrook. It was 1987, and I was 32, still living in this very house where I grew up, tending to the same garden beds my mother and grandmother had lovingly worked before me. You know, people always ask me why I never married, why I never had children of my own. But the truth is, I had this whole town full of people to love, and my garden, well, my garden was where I poured all my maternal instincts. Every seed I planted, every seedling I nurtured, they were all my babies in a way. That particular spring started like any other. The last frost had passed, the soil was warming up, and I was planting my usual garden, rows of green beans, a patch of sweet corn, some zucchini that would inevitably take over half the yard, and of course, my tomatoes. I always grew the same varieties: big boy, better boy, and early girl. Reliable, predictable, perfect for the jars of sauce I'd put up every August. But that year, something different happened. Something that would remind me, and everyone in Willowbrook, that sometimes the most extraordinary things come from the most ordinary moments, and that magic isn't about what we possess, but about what we choose to share. So pour yourself another cup of tea, dear one, and let me tell you about the summer of the miracle tomato. Now, to understand the story properly, you need to know a little bit about the Wilson family garden. That's my family. The Wilsons have been growing things in this same plot of earth for 4 generations. My great-great-grandmother, Esther Wilson, was the one who started it all back in 1892. Esther was quite the character, let me tell you. She stood all of 4 feet 11 inches in her Sunday shoes, but she had the determination of a woman twice her size. The story goes that when she and my great-great-grandfather first arrived in Willowbrook, there wasn't much here but a train station and a general store. The land was mostly wild prairie grass and stubborn clay soil that didn't want to cooperate with anyone's farming ambitions. But Esther, bless her heart, took one look at this patch of earth behind what would become our family home and declared, "This is where I'm going to grow the finest vegetables this side of the Mississippi." Everyone thought she was a bit touched in the head, especially when she started talking to her plants. But wouldn't you know it, that first year she harvested tomatoes the size of dinner plates and cucumbers so crisp they snapped when you bit into them. My great-grandmother Rose inherited both the garden and Esther's gift for growing things. Rose was the one who started the tradition of sharing the harvest with anyone who needed it. During the Depression, folks would line up at our back gate every morning, and Rose would send them home with baskets full of whatever was ready to pick. She used to say, "The earth gives us more than we can ever eat, so we better make sure everyone gets their share." Then came my grandmother, Margaret. We called her Grandma Maggie. Now, Maggie was a tiny woman with hands that could make anything grow, but she had one peculiar habit. She insisted on singing to her plants. Not just humming while she worked, mind you, but full-on concert performances. She'd be out there at dawn, serenading the tomatoes with hymns, crooning lullabies to the lettuce, and belting out show tunes while she weeded the carrots. The neighbors thought she was eccentric, but that woman could grow vegetables that would make you weep with joy. Her tomatoes were legendary. So sweet and juicy that people would drive from 3 counties over just to buy a basket at the farmer's market. And her secret? She swore it was the music. "Plants are living things," she'd tell me when I was little, "and all living things need love and attention, and a good song now and then." My mother, Dorothy, was more practical than Grandma Maggie, but she kept the tradition alive. She was the one who taught me that gardening isn't just about the vegetables you grow. It's about the community you cultivate. Every Saturday during growing season, she'd host garden club in our backyard. Really, it was just an excuse for all the neighborhood ladies to drink iced tea, eat pound cake, and gossip while they helped with the weeding and harvesting. Mrs. Henderson would bring her famous 7-layer salad. Mrs. Patterson always showed up with a batch of her buttermilk biscuits. And Mrs. Chen, who lived 3 houses down, would arrive with mason jars of her homemade kimchi that she'd trade for fresh vegetables. It was like a little United Nations right here in our garden. By the time I inherited the garden, I was carrying on a tradition that had fed not just our family, but half the town for nearly a century. I had the music from Grandma Maggie, though I stuck mostly to soft humming rather than full performances, and the community spirit from my mother. And then there were the characters who made that summer so special. First, there was Uncle Joe. Not actually my uncle, but my mother's cousin who'd been Uncle Joe to everyone in town for as long as anyone could remember. Joe was 73 that year, with wild white hair that stuck up in all directions and overalls that had seen better decades. He lived 2 blocks over in a little house that was more garden than house, really. His specialty was growing the most unusual vegetables you'd ever seen. Purple carrots, white eggplants, and tomatoes in colors that didn't seem natural. Uncle Joe had this theory that plants were like people. They got bored eating the same thing every day, so he fed his vegetables a different meal each week. Monday was coffee grounds and eggshells. Tuesday was leftover soup. Wednesday was whatever he could find in his compost pile. The man talked to his plants like they were his children, and somehow it worked. His garden was a wonderland of strange and beautiful things. Then there was Mrs. Baker, our next-door neighbor. Eleanor Baker was the opposite of Uncle Joe in every way imaginable. Where Joe was chaotic and creative, Mrs. Baker was precise and methodical. Her garden looked like it had been designed by an architect and maintained by a team of Swiss watchmakers. Every plant was exactly 6 inches apart. Every row was perfectly straight. Every stake was the exact same height. Mrs. Baker had moved to Willowbrook just 2 years before this story takes place, and she'd been trying to win the county fair's best garden competition ever since. She'd come in second place both years, and I could tell it was eating at her. She'd installed a sprinkler system, started using fancy fertilizers, and even brought in a soil specialist from the state university. Her garden was beautiful, don't get me wrong, but it lacked soul somehow. And then there was Pickles, my sweet old golden retriever. Pickles was 12 years old that summer, which is getting on in years for a big dog, but he was still my constant companion in the garden. He had this habit of following me around while I worked, occasionally digging holes in places I definitely didn't want holes and barking at the tomato plants like they were intruders who needed to be warned off. Pickles had been with me since he was a puppy, and he knew the garden routine better than most people. He knew that morning watering meant he could drink from the hose. He knew that harvest time meant dropped vegetables he could sneak and eat, and he knew that my afternoon rest under the old oak tree meant nap time for him too. These were the people, and the dog, who would witness what happened that summer. The summer when one small tomato seedling would remind us all that the most amazing things in life often come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the greatest magic is simply opening your heart to share what you've been given. Now, the seedling that started it all was nothing special to look at. I'd bought it at Morrison's Hardware on a Tuesday morning in mid-May, along with my usual 6-pack of Better Boys and a few marigolds to keep the pests away. Old Mr. Morrison, bless his heart, was clearing out his remaining seedlings to make room for summer merchandise, and he practically gave me that last little tomato plant. "This one's been sitting here for 3 weeks," he said, holding up a rather sad-looking seedling, with only 4 leaves and a stem so thin it looked like it might break if you breathed on it wrong. "Tell you what, Aunt C, take it for free. Maybe you can work your magic on it." I almost said no. The poor thing looked like it had already given up on life. But something about its determination to keep those 4 little leaves reaching toward the light touched my heart. So I took it home and planted it in the corner of my tomato patch, right next to the old oak tree, where the soil was richest from years of fallen leaves. I gave it the same care I gave all my plants: a good drink of water, a handful of compost, and a little conversation. "Now you listen here, little one," I told it, feeling only slightly foolish for talking to a plant that might not even survive the week. "You're in good soil now with good neighbors. Just do your best, and we'll see what happens." For the first 2 weeks, nothing unusual happened. The little plant grew slowly but steadily, just like tomato plants are supposed to do. It developed a stronger stem, put out a few more leaves, and started to look like it might actually survive after all. I was pleased but not surprised. The Wilson family soil had been nurturing plants back to health for generations. But then, on a Tuesday morning in early June, I stepped out into my garden with my coffee cup and nearly dropped it right there in the dirt. The little tomato plant had grown 2 feet overnight. Not 2 inches, 2 feet. I stood there in my nightgown and slippers, staring at this plant that had been knee-high when I'd watered it the evening before, and was now nearly as tall as I was. The stem was thick and sturdy, the leaves were a vibrant green I'd never seen before, and there were flower buds forming all along the branches. "Well, I said to Pickles, who was sitting beside me with his head tilted like he was trying to figure out what had changed overnight, too. "That's unusual." I called Uncle Joe right away. He came shuffling over in his house slippers, took one look at the plant, and let out a whistle that could have called dogs from 3 counties over. "And see," he said, walking around the plant like it was a sculpture in a museum. "In all my years of gardening, I have never seen anything like this. Look at these leaves. Feel this stem. This isn't just growth, this is... "Magic?" I suggested. "Well, I wasn't going to say it first, but yes, this is magic." We stood there for a while just marveling at this impossible plant. Then Uncle Joe, being Uncle Joe, had to go investigate. He got down on his hands and knees and started examining the soil around the base of the plant. "Aunt C," he said, his voice muffled because his face was practically pressed to the dirt. "There's something different about this soil. It's warmer than it should be, and it smells like springtime and Christmas morning and fresh baked bread all mixed together." I knelt down beside him, and he was right. The soil around the base of the plant was definitely warmer than the rest of the garden, and it had the most wonderful smell, like all the best things in the world had been mixed together and buried in the earth. That afternoon, Mrs. Baker noticed the commotion and came over to see what we were fussing about. When she saw the plant, her perfectly composed expression cracked just a little. "That's impossible," she said, adjusting her gardening gloves. "Tomato plants don't grow that fast. There must be some explanation. Maybe you used some kind of growth hormone? Or special fertilizer?" I assured her I hadn't done anything different, but I could see she didn't believe me. Mrs. Baker was a woman who believed in scientific explanations for everything, and a tomato plant growing 2 feet overnight definitely didn't fit into her orderly view of the world. But the plant wasn't finished with us yet. Not by a long shot. By the end of the week, it was 8 feet tall and had started producing tomatoes. Not just any tomatoes. These were the most beautiful, perfect tomatoes I'd ever seen. They were the size of softballs, deep red with just a hint of gold around the stem. And when you bit into one, the juice ran down your chin like sunshine. Uncle Joe brought his ladder over so we could reach the higher branches, and that's when we realized the plant had grown so tall, it was starting to shade Mrs. Baker's prized garden. She was not pleased. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry," I called over the fence. "I had no idea it would get this big. Would you like me to trim it back?" But even as I said it, I knew I couldn't bring myself to cut this magnificent plant. It was like asking me to trim back a rainbow. By the second week, the plant was 15 feet tall and had started growing over the fence into Mrs. Baker's yard. The branches were loaded with tomatoes, and the smell was attracting bees from miles around. My garden had become a symphony of buzzing, and the air was thick with the scent of tomato blossoms. That's when the visitors started coming. First, it was just neighbors walking by who stopped to stare. Then, it was people from across town who'd heard about the giant tomato plant on Maple Street. By the third week, we had cars parked up and down the block, and people were taking pictures and asking if they could buy tomatoes. I started keeping a basket by the back gate with a sign that said, "Free tomatoes. Please take only what you need." But the plant was producing so many tomatoes that I could barely keep up with the picking. I was making sauce, salsa, tomato soup, and giving away bags of tomatoes to anyone who wanted them. The plant just kept growing, 20 feet, 25 feet, 30 feet. The branches were so heavy with fruit that Uncle Joe and I had to build a support system using old fence posts and chicken wire to keep them from breaking. By the end of June, the plant was 40 feet tall and had started growing over the roof of my house. From the street, it looked like a giant green umbrella was shading half the property. The local newspaper sent a photographer, and suddenly I was getting phone calls from reporters as far away as Chicago. But the real magic wasn't in the size of the plant or the number of tomatoes it produced. The real magic was in what it did to our little town. People who had never spoken to each other before were now gathering in my backyard every evening, sharing tomatoes and stories and laughter. Mrs. Chen brought her whole family over to see the plant, and her grandmother, who rarely spoke English, took one bite of a tomato, and started crying happy tears. She said something in Chinese that Mrs. Chen translated as, "This tastes like home." Even Mrs. Baker, despite her initial skepticism, had to admit that the tomatoes were unlike anything she'd ever tasted. She started bringing over her measuring cups and notebooks, trying to figure out the scientific explanation for what was happening. "There has to be a logical reason," she kept saying. "Plants don't just grow like this without cause." But Uncle Joe would just smile and pat her shoulder. "Maybe, Eleanor," he'd say. "Or maybe some things are just meant to be beautiful and mysterious. And that's reason enough." The plant continued growing through July, reaching almost 50 feet tall and spreading its branches over 3 backyards. Children would come by after school, just to stand under it and look up at the canopy of leaves and fruit above their heads. It was like having a living cathedral right there in suburbia. And every morning I would wake up to find new tomatoes had ripened overnight, ready to be shared with whoever needed them. The plant was teaching me something about abundance, that when you have more than you need, the only sensible thing to do is share it with others. Little did I know that this miraculous plant was just getting started, and that the real surprises were yet to come. By the middle of July, the miracle tomato plant had become the talk of not just Willowbrook, but the entire county. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Giant Tomato Plant Brings Community Together." And suddenly, our quiet little town was getting more visitors than it had seen since the train station closed in 1962. That's when Mayor Peterson showed up at my door with a proposition that would change everything. "And see," he said, settling his considerable bulk into my kitchen chair and accepting a glass of sweet tea, "I've been thinking, this plant of yours has brought more people to Willowbrook in the past month than our tourism board has managed in the past decade. What would you say to making this into something official?" I wasn't sure what he meant by official, but Mayor Peterson was a man who thought big. He was already envisioning street vendors, parking areas, and guided tours. But what he proposed next was something entirely different. What if we had a festival? A celebration of community and sharing, with your tomato plant as the centerpiece. We could call it the Willowbrook Tomato Festival, and all the proceeds could go to the food bank and the community center. The idea of turning my garden into a festival made me a little nervous, but when I saw how excited he was, and when I thought about all the people who had been coming by just to experience a little bit of magic, I found myself nodding. "What did you have in mind?" I asked. Mayor Peterson pulled out a notebook that was already filled with ideas. "Well, we could have tomato pie contests, of course, and maybe a tomato growing competition. Oh, and dancing. We could set up a stage right there under your plant and have live music every evening." Within a week, the entire town was buzzing with festival preparations. The ladies from the church organized the cooking competitions. The high school band volunteered to play. Local businesses donated supplies and prizes. Even Mrs. Baker, who had initially been skeptical about the whole thing, offered to chair the committee for the tomato growing contest. My kitchen became the unofficial headquarters for festival planning. Every morning, I'd wake up to find 3 or 4 people already sitting at my table, drinking coffee and discussing booth locations or entertainment schedules. Uncle Joe appointed himself as the official plant guardian and spent his days giving impromptu tours to visitors, telling elaborate stories about the plant's magical properties. "Now, you see this branch here?" he'd say to a group of wide-eyed children, pointing to a particularly heavy cluster of tomatoes. "This branch only produces tomatoes on Tuesdays and Fridays, and if you listen very carefully, you can hear the plant humming in the morning." The children would press their ears to the trunk, and sure enough, Uncle Joe would hum softly from behind them, making them squeal with delight when they thought they'd discovered another magical property of the plant. But the real magic was happening in my kitchen. Every day, people would bring me bags of tomatoes from the plant, and I'd spend hours cooking them into sauces, soups, and dishes to share. Mrs. Patterson brought her grandmother's recipe for tomato jam. Mrs. Chen contributed her secret for the most amazing tomato and egg stir-fry. Even Mrs. Baker, despite her scientific skepticism, shared her prize-winning recipe for tomato aspic. My little kitchen became like a cooking school, with women of all ages learning from each other and sharing family recipes that had been handed down through generations. We were creating our own cookbook, right there at my kitchen table, with every recipe featuring tomatoes from the miracle plant. The festival was scheduled for the first weekend in August, but by the last week of July, We already had people camping in the park and local bed and breakfasts booked solid. The mayor arranged for food trucks to park along Main Street, and local artisans set up booths selling tomato-themed crafts and artwork. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the local flower shop, created the most beautiful tomato leaf centerpieces I'd ever seen. Mr. Patterson, the town's only artist, painted a mural on the side of the hardware store featuring the miracle plant in all its glory. Even Dr. Williams, our family physician, got into the spirit by offering free blood pressure checks at a booth decorated with tomato-shaped balloons. The cooking competitions were planned for Saturday afternoon, with categories for everything from traditional tomato pie to the most creative tomato-based dish. I was asked to be one of the judges, along with the head chef from the fancy restaurant 2 towns over, and Mrs. Patterson, who was known throughout the county for her cooking. But the highlight of the festival was planned for Saturday evening, a community dance under the branches of the miracle plant. The high school kids had strung lights through the branches, and the local band had been practicing songs that somehow related to gardens, growing, and community. Uncle Joe had convinced the mayor to let him give a special presentation about the, quote, history and magic of the Wilson family garden. I was a little worried about what stories he might tell, but I had to admit that Uncle Joe had a gift for making everything sound more interesting than it actually was. The ladies from the church had organized a potluck dinner for Saturday evening, with every dish featuring tomatoes from the plant. Mrs. Chen was making her famous tomato and corn salad. Mrs. Baker had volunteered to make her prize-winning tomato aspic. And I was planning to make the largest batch of tomato sauce I'd ever attempted, using my great-grandmother's recipe that had been in the family for generations. By the Wednesday before the festival, my backyard looked like a small fairground. There were booths being constructed, a stage being assembled, and strings of lights being hung from every available branch. The miracle plant seemed to be enjoying all the attention. If it was possible for a plant to enjoy anything, and was producing more tomatoes than ever. That's when Mrs. Baker made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I've been thinking," she said during one of our morning planning sessions, "and have decided to withdraw from the tomato growing competition." We all stared at her. Mrs. Baker had been planning for this competition for months, carefully nurturing her prize plants and documenting their growth with scientific precision. "Why?" asked Mrs. Patterson. Mrs. Baker looked out the window at the miracle plant, its branches heavy with fruit, and smiled. "Because I've realized that this isn't really about competition. It's about community. And I'd rather spend the festival enjoying what we've all created together than worrying about winning a ribbon." That afternoon, Mrs. Baker did something that shocked everyone. She opened her garden gate and put up a sign that said, "Free vegetables, please take what you need." She was following the example of the miracle plant, sharing her abundance with anyone who wanted it. The festival was still 3 days away, but already it had accomplished something wonderful. It had reminded all of us that the best things in life, friendship, community, generosity, and love, are meant to be shared, not hoarded. Little did we know that the festival would bring us together in ways we never expected, and that the miracle plant still had one more surprise in store for us. The first sign of trouble came on Thursday morning, 2 days before the festival was set to begin. I was in the kitchen, making my usual morning coffee, when I heard Pickles barking, in a way I'd never heard before. Not his usual, "someone's at the door" bark or his, "there's a squirrel in the garden" bark, but a deep, worried bark that made my blood run cold. I rushed outside to find Uncle Joe standing under the miracle plant with his hands on his hips, staring up at the branches with a frown that creased his entire face. "What's wrong?" I asked, though I could already see that something was different. The plant, which had been vibrant and full of life just the evening before, looked wilted. Not terribly, but enough to notice. The leaves had lost some of their brilliant green color, and a few of the lower branches were drooping. "I don't know," Uncle Joe said, shaking his head. "I've been out here since dawn, and I can't figure it out. The soil is still warm, it's been getting plenty of water, and the weather's been perfect. But look at it, Aunt C. Something's not right." I knelt down and pressed my hands to the soil around the base of the plant. Uncle Joe was right. It was still warm, and it still had that wonderful smell of spring and Christmas morning and fresh-baked bread. But there was something else now, something that made my stomach turn. A sour note in the symphony of scents, like milk that had been left out too long. That's when Mrs. Baker came hurrying over, her notebook in hand and her face pale with worry. "I've been monitoring the plant's condition since Tuesday," she said, flipping through pages of measurements and observations. "Yesterday evening, the soil temperature around the base dropped by 3 degrees. The pH level has shifted from neutral to slightly acidic. And, look at this." She pointed to a section of soil near the trunk where the earth looked disturbed, as if someone had been digging. "Someone's been here," Uncle Joe said, his voice quiet but angry. "Someone's been messing with our plant." We called Mayor Peterson immediately, and within an hour, half the town was gathered in my backyard, staring at the miracle plant with worry and confusion. The plant wasn't dying, but it was definitely struggling, and nobody could explain why. That's when Mrs. Chen made a discovery that chilled us all to the bone. She had been walking around the perimeter of the property, looking for any other signs of disturbance, when she called out from the far corner of the yard. "There's something here," she said, her voice strange and wondering. "The storm washed away some of the soil, and there's something buried under the plant." We all rushed over to where she was kneeling. The heavy rain had indeed washed away a good portion of the soil around the base of the miracle plant, and there, about 2 feet down, something was glinting in the dim light from my back porch. "It looks like metal," Mrs. Baker said, brushing away more of the wet earth with her hands, "like a box or container of some kind." Uncle Joe ran to his house and came back with a small shovel and a flashlight. Very carefully, trying not to disturb the plant's roots, we began to excavate around the mysterious object. What we found was an old metal box, about the size of a shoebox, made of tin that had somehow survived decades underground without rusting through completely. It was wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, and when we lifted it out of the earth, we could feel that there was something inside. "Should we open it?" I asked, my heart pounding with anticipation and a little bit of fear. "I think we have to," Uncle Joe said softly. "I think this box has been waiting for us to find it." We carried the box into my kitchen, where Mrs. Chen and her family were still waiting out the storm. Under the bright kitchen lights, we could see that the oilcloth was actually a very old tablecloth, faded and worn but still intact. And wrapped inside the tablecloth was an envelope with my great-great-grandmother's name, written on it in careful script, "For Esther Wilson and her descendants." With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, written in the same careful handwriting, and a small cloth pouch that rattled when I shook it. "Read it out loud," Uncle Joe said, settling into his chair with the same reverence he might have shown in church. I unfolded the letter, and this is what it said. "My dearest Esther, if you are reading this letter, then you have found the seeds that I buried beneath the oak tree in what will someday be your garden. My name is Thomas McKenna, and I am writing this in the year 1891, 1 year before you and your husband will arrive in Willowbrook. I am dying, and I have no family to leave my most precious possession to. But I have heard that a young couple from the East is coming to settle in our small town, and that they plan to farm the land behind what will become their home. I hope that couple is you. These seeds are special, Esther. They came from my grandmother's garden in Ireland, brought to America during the Great Hunger, when my family fled their homeland with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a small pouch of seeds sewn into my grandmother's skirt. My grandmother, Bridget McKenna, was known throughout County Cork for her ability to grow food when others could not. During the worst years of the famine, when the potato crops failed and people were starving, her garden kept our entire village alive. She would give away everything she grew, keeping only what her family needed to survive. The night before we left Ireland, she gave me these seeds and made me promise that wherever I settled, I would plant them only when the community needed them most. She said they were blessed, not with magic, but with the power of love and sacrifice and the determination to feed others before yourself. I have carried these seeds with me for 40 years, through the journey to America, through the war, through the building of our railroad and our town. I have been waiting for the right time to plant them, but I realize now that the right time is not for me to decide. It is for you to decide, and for your children and their children. Plant these seeds when your community needs to remember what it means to share with one another. Plant them when people have forgotten that the earth gives us more than we need, and that abundance is meant to be shared, not hoarded. The seeds will know when the time is right. They will wait in the soil until the moment comes when they are needed most. And when they grow, They will produce more food than you ever imagined possible, but only if you promise to give it away freely to anyone who needs it. I am burying this letter and these seeds beneath the oak tree, because I believe that tree will outlive us all, and because I believe that you, Esther Wilson, are the kind of person who will understand what these seeds represent. Take care of them, and they will take care of your community for generations to come. With hope and faith in the future. Thomas McKenna. October 15, 1891. The kitchen was completely silent when I finished reading. Mrs. Chen was crying softly, and Uncle Joe was staring at the letter like it contained the secrets of the universe. "The famine seeds," Mrs. Baker whispered. "These are seeds from the Irish potato famine." I opened the small cloth pouch that had been in the envelope. Inside were 3 small, dark seeds that looked like they could have been tomato seeds, but there was something different about them. They seemed to shimmer in the light, and they were warm to the touch. "Only 3 seeds," I said, counting them again to make sure. "One for each generation," Uncle Joe said softly. "Your great-great-grandmother must have planted one. Your grandmother probably planted another. And you." "I planted the 3rd one," I finished. "This spring, when I planted that little seedling from Morrison's Hardware." But Mrs. Baker, ever the scientist, was shaking her head. "That doesn't make sense. You didn't plant a seed. You planted a seedling that you bought at the hardware store." I thought about that for a moment, and then I remembered something. Mr. Morrison said that seedling had been sitting in his store for 3 weeks. He said it looked like it had given up on life. "What if," Uncle Joe said slowly, "what if that seedling was carrying one of Thomas McKenna's seeds? What if somehow, someway, one of those blessed seeds found its way into a regular tomato plant? And it's been waiting all this time for the right moment to show itself." It sounded impossible, but then again, everything about the miracle plant had seemed impossible. "There's more," Mrs. Chen said, pointing to the bottom of the letter. "Look at what he says about the community, needing to remember what it means to share." I read that part of the letter again, and suddenly everything made sense. The plant hadn't started growing until after I'd put up the sign, offering free tomatoes. It had grown strongest when people were gathering in my garden, sharing stories and recipes and laughter. And it had started to struggle when someone tried to steal it, when greed and selfishness had entered the picture. "The plant responds to the spirit of the community," I said, understanding flooding through me. "It grows when we share, and it struggles when we become selfish." "That's why it survived the storm," Mrs. Baker said, her scientific mind working through the implications. "Because we all worked together to save it. Because we put the community before ourselves." Uncle Joe picked up one of the remaining seeds from the pouch and held it up to the light. "And now we know why Thomas McKenna buried these seeds here. He knew that someday Willowbrook would need to remember what it means to be a community. He knew that we would need to be reminded that the best things in life are meant to be shared." As we sat there in my kitchen, holding the letter and the seeds and the weight of this incredible story, I realized that the miracle plant had given us something far more valuable than tomatoes or even magic. It had given us the knowledge that we were part of something bigger than ourselves, connected to generations of people who had understood that taking care of each other was the most important thing we could do. The plant hadn't just grown in my garden. It had grown in our hearts, reminding us that abundance without generosity is meaningless, and that the greatest miracles happen when people come together to share what they have with others. And now, with the festival just one day away, we had a story to tell that was even more amazing than a giant tomato plant. We had a story about love, sacrifice, and the power of community that stretched back over a century and across an ocean.